let's be honest with each other. By now, you've probably seen so many celebrity scandals that nothing seems shocking anymore. Cheating scandals? Old news. Messy divorces? Standard Hollywood drama. Lawsuits, bankruptcies, addictions, those are practically expected at this point. But every once in a while, a story comes out that feels different. It's not just gossip. It's not just tabloid fluff. It's the kind of revelation that makes the internet stop scrolling and makes everyone whisper to themselves, wait, did I really just hear that right? And that's exactly what happened when a name dropped into the middle of a controversy that no one was ready for. Because this time, it wasn't some random actor who had a fall from grace moment. This wasn't about a one-hit wonder influencer who got canceled over a reckless tweet. This time, it was about Justin Bieber, one of the biggest pop stars of our generation, linked to something unsettling, something disturbing, something that no one ever thought would resurface. And at the center of it all was Sean Combs, better known as Diddy, one of the most powerful moguls the music industry has ever seen. Now, we've seen Diddy's name attached to all kinds of headlines over the years. Multi-platinum records, lavish parties, billion-dollar business ventures. And yes, more than a few controversies. But this particular story, this one is different. Because it's tied to a confession from Bieber himself. A confession that, when pieced together with everything we know now, suddenly doesn't look so innocent anymore. And if you're wondering why people are still talking about this years later, here's the answer. Because what Bieber revealed wasn't just awkward or weird. No, it pointed to a much bigger problem. A darker culture in Hollywood that preys on the young, the vulnerable, and the desperate. So today, we're going deep. We're going to unravel what really happened between Justin Bieber and Diddy. We'll look at the timeline, the disturbing details, the industry silence, and most importantly, why this confession matters more today than ever before. Grab your seat, because this one isn't just celebrity drama. This is about power, exploitation, and the twisted side of fame. Let's rewind the clock. It's 2009. If you were alive back then and had access to the internet, you couldn't escape it. Bieber fever had officially taken over the world. Justin was barely 15 years old, and he was already breaking records. His breakout hit Baby was everywhere, on the radio, in malls, blasting out of every teenager's iPod. Girls lined up outside stadiums just to catch a glimpse of him. For a while, it felt like Justin wasn't just a pop star, he was a cultural phenomenon. But here's the thing. Behind the swoopy hair, the innocent smile, and the carefully crafted teen heartthrob image, something else was going on. Something that didn't make sense at the time. But now, it's raising serious questions. Because around that exact same time, Justin caught the attention of someone much older, much more powerful, and far more experienced in the industry, Diddy. Now, on the surface, this didn't seem all that strange. After all, Diddy was a legendary figure in music. He'd built empires. He'd mentored stars. He knew the game better than anyone. So for him to take an interest in a young rising star wasn't necessarily a red flag, at least not immediately. But then the details started to emerge. And those details didn't look like normal mentorship. Justin and Diddy were seen together at parties, not just industry mixers, but adult parties. They were spotted hanging out in ways that raised eyebrows. And then came the footage, the videos that even today fans describe as unsettling. And if you've ever watched those clips, you know exactly why people are still talking about them. So, let's get to the part that shocked the world. Justin later admitted, in interviews, in conversations, in reflections, that when he was just 15 years old, Diddy made him an offer. Diddy said he wanted to spend 48 hours with Justin. No phones, no managers, no friends. Think about that for a second. This wasn't about a quick mentorship session in a studio. This wasn't about giving career advice over lunch. This was about a grown man, nearly 40 years old at the time, asking to isolate a 15-year-old boy for 2 straight days. And if that doesn't make you pause, here's the kicker. There's actual footage of Diddy saying this himself. He's on camera, smiling, laughing, talking about it as some harmless joke. But to fans, and especially in hindsight, this was anything but funny. Because when Justin looked back on those interactions later, he didn't describe them as mentorship. He described them as weird. He called them confusing. He admitted they didn't feel right. And that's why people call this his disturbing confession. Because when you line up the timeline, when you connect the dots, when you compare Justin's words to Diddy's actions, suddenly the picture that forms is one that looks less like mentorship and more like manipulation. This wasn't just a casual friendship. This wasn't just industry networking. This was something deeper, something unsettling, something that hinted at the darker underbelly of fame. But let me ask you this. Where was the outrage back then? Why didn't anyone in the industry step in? Why didn't the adults around Justin, his label, his management, his family, put a stop to this? The answer is chilling, but also predictable. Power. Diddy wasn't just another celebrity. He was a kingmaker. He had the money, the influence, the record label connections. He could make or break careers with a single phone call. And Justin? He was a kid, a teenager thrown into the spotlight, surrounded by adults who were more focused on the money machine than on protecting him. So what happened? Exactly what happens in so many of these stories. It got brushed under the rug. The headlines stayed clean. The money kept flowing. Hollywood turned a blind eye. And for years, no one said a word. But here's the thing about time. It has a way of catching up with people. Because now, more than a decade later, Justin's words are being heard in a completely different light. What once seemed like a harmless story about mentorship now looks like a red flag that everyone ignored. And the silence? That silence speaks louder than anything. Now, some people will say, come on, maybe it was innocent. Maybe people are overreacting, but let's break that down logically. Why would a nearly 40-year-old man want to spend 2 days alone with a 15-year-old boy? Why phrase it like a deal? Almost like a transaction. And why does Justin, even years later, describe the whole thing as weird? This isn't about painting Bieber as weak. This is about recognizing the power imbalance. Hollywood has a long history of putting kids in vulnerable positions. Kids get thrown into the spotlight, chewed up by the system, and surrounded by adults who don't always have their best interests in mind. And Bieber's confession is proof of that imbalance. Proof that even at the top levels of fame, young artists are still vulnerable. And if you think this was an isolated case, think again. Because when you start digging into Diddy's history, you see something more chilling. A pattern. Diddy's name hasn't just been tied to Bieber. Over the years, there have been other stories, other young stars, other questionable relationships. From the outside, it might look like mentorship, but when you stack up the interviews, the leaked clips, the rumors, the confessions, it starts to look less like mentorship and more like grooming. And that's what makes Justin Bieber's words so powerful, because he wasn't an outsider speculating. He was there. He lived it. He felt it. And now, years later, he's calling it what it really was, disturbing. Here's the part that should keep you up at night. This isn't just about Justin. His confession is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. A puzzle that reveals a culture in Hollywood where power is unchecked, where young stars are vulnerable, and where people with influence can get away with almost anything. And when you see how many times these stories resurface, how many rumors get ignored, how many confessions get brushed aside, you start to realize this isn't random. This is systemic. It's the dark side of fame that no one wants to talk about. But today, we're talking about it. Because if you thought Bieber's confession was disturbing on its own, wait until you see what happens when you connect the dots. When we zoom out, Bieber's story doesn't just look like a one-off awkward encounter. It fits into something far more disturbing, a blueprint of how the entertainment industry has treated young talent for decades. Think about it. Justin wasn't just a kid with a dream. He was a goldmine. At 15, he was already pulling in millions of dollars for his label, selling out arenas, and fueling a global fan base. He was the perfect product. And products in Hollywood? They're rarely protected. They're exploited. That's why Diddy's involvement feels so sinister in retrospect. He wasn't just mentoring Bieber. He was inserting himself into the life of a vulnerable teenager whose career and innocence was at stake. And when you rewatch those old clips of Diddy proudly saying he had 48 hours with Justin, you can literally feel the discomfort in Bieber's body language, the nervous laughs, the avoidance, the way his eyes dart around as if he wants to escape the situation. It wasn't a moment of pride. It was a moment of survival. And the more you think about it, the more disturbing it becomes. Because if this happened in front of cameras, where Diddy was confident enough to joke about it publicly, what happened behind closed doors? Because when you look at Diddy's history, the red flags don't stop with Bieber. His name has been tied to a string of controversies for decades. Party culture, questionable contracts, lawsuits, allegations that seem to pop up every few years, only to mysteriously disappear. And if you start connecting those dots, a pattern emerges. It's a pattern of control, a pattern of exploitation, a pattern of surrounding himself with young talent, promising mentorship, and then leaving behind a trail of whispers that never quite die. That's why Bieber's confession feels so powerful now, because it's not just a random memory. It's a piece of evidence in a much bigger case against the culture Diddy represented. Now let's flip the perspective. Let's put ourselves in Bieber's shoes. Imagine being 15. You're at the top of the world, but at the same time, you're still a kid trying to figure out who you are. You're dealing with puberty, fame, exhaustion, and a world that suddenly treats you like a product instead of a person. And then a powerful mogul, someone nearly 3 times your age, decides he wants 48 hours alone with you. How do you process that? The answer is you don't. You just cope. You laugh it off. You call it weird years later. But deep down, the scars remain. And if you've followed Justin's career, you've seen those scars. The breakdowns, the reckless behavior, the battles with addiction, the public meltdowns where he admitted he was struggling with the pressure. Of course, fame itself is toxic enough to break anyone. But when you add in the disturbing encounters he went through as a kid, suddenly his struggles don't just look like celebrity drama. They look like the consequences of trauma. And that's exactly what Bieber has hinted at over the years, that the industry chewed him up, used him, and nearly spit him out. Here's where things get even creepier, because Bieber's story isn't unique. When you start digging into other young stars in Hollywood, you hear the same themes repeated again and again. A powerful adult takes an unusual interest. A vulnerable teenager feels trapped. The public laughs it off as mentorship. And years later, the truth finally comes out. Think of Britney Spears. Think of Lindsay Lohan. Think of child actors from Nickelodeon and Disney who later revealed they were mistreated, manipulated, or worse. Hollywood runs on this cycle of silence, and Bieber just happened to be one of the few brave enough to call it out, albeit years after the fact. And when his story gets linked back to Diddy, it confirms what many people already suspected, that the entertainment industry has been protecting predators for years. At the end of the day, you might be wondering, why does this matter now? Bieber has moved on. Diddy has bigger scandals surrounding him. Why drag this back up? The answer is simple. Because the system hasn't changed. There are still kids being thrown into the spotlight today. There are still moguls with unchecked power. There are still vulnerable stars being manipulated under the guise of mentorship. And unless we talk about stories like Bieber's, nothing changes. The silence continues. The abuse continues, and the cycle repeats. That's why his confession matters. That's why people are dissecting it today. And that's why it deserves more than just a passing glance. Because when you strip away the fame, the music, and the glitz, this isn't just about Bieber or Diddy. It's about the exploitation of young people in a system that values money over humanity. And until that changes, stories like this will keep happening. But here's the chilling thing. Bieber's confession was only the beginning. Because when you look deeper into Diddy's history, when you start piecing together all the stories, the rumors, the lawsuits, and the whispers, the disturbing truth gets even harder to ignore. And the more you uncover, the more you realize this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, a blueprint, a carefully hidden culture that operated in plain sight. When you step back and really think about it, if that can happen to Justin Bieber, what about the countless other young stars who didn't have the fame, the money, or the platform to speak out? How many of them got caught in the same cycle, but never had the chance to share their story? That's the part of Hollywood most people don't see. The glossy magazine covers and sold-out arenas distract us from the darker truths hidden in plain sight. Because as you dig deeper, you start to notice a pattern. Similar names, similar stories, similar mentorships, that when you really break them down, don't seem so innocent after all. And in those whispers, in those unspoken connections, lies the real truth about how deep this rabbit hole goes. That's why Justin's confession matters. Not because it's juicy gossip, but because it's one piece of evidence in a much larger puzzle, one that points to an entire system built on silence, money, and power. And the more we dig, the clearer it becomes. Bieber might not be the only one. So don't go anywhere, because if you thought this was disturbing, wait until you hear the other names tied to this same web. Names that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about fame, power, and the entertainment industry. This is just the surface. And if you're ready to keep going deeper with me, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Because trust me, what's coming next is bigger than just Justin.